The future of the Philadelphia 76ers and their chances at a championship will ultimately be determined by what goes down this offseason. We're in the midst of the biggest offseason during the Joel Embiid era, and this feels like the last chance to truly put the ship on the right track. We have a little bit clarity for what those final contenders are, who the prospects are for the big four the Sixers are targeting. So I did want to dive into the latest reports on this, acknowledge the pros and cons of each of these guys, as well as the contract that is attached and how that impacts the way they can even get this player. So I'm going to start off with the initial report saying that the 76ers want a max salary player from a pool that includes Paul George, LeBron James, Jimmy Butler, and Brandon Ingram, per Keith Pompey of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Now, this is no secret to this point. We know that they're big game hunting, that they're trying to land that third star, and that is the way that Daryl Morey operates. That it's very clear when looking at the history of the way he manages a basketball team and an organization as a whole. He likes the big names. He likes the big stars. And the NBA has become very much a copycat league, that when one team finds the blueprint for how you get to a championship, everyone wants to shift and follow in that direction. We've seen the Big Three era kind of come and go. We've seen this new trend where teams are leaning into heavily of having the right role players in place, having guys that bring out the right complementary skills with their superstars, and there are pros and cons to each of those. And for what it's worth, I think you can get both right, and I think you can get both wrong. That for the Big Three approach, which seems to be the direction these Sixers are leaning, that you can get it right if you get enough quality talent. That you need those three guys to be that special that they can command enough production for the money to be worth it. An example of that going right, we can talk about the Miami Heat if you want to bring back the LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh. But what should be noted in that situation is guys have to have the right mental approach to be willing to take a back seat when it is time, be willing to have those possessions where you don't have the ball in your hand, which for the category of players we're talking about are not accustomed to that. An example where a big three goes wrong, look right out in Phoenix right now. A guy like Bradley Beal, who's commanding $50+ million in a year in and year out standpoint, still with several years left on his contract. Oh, and a no trade clause, by the way. That's not great. It's tough to overcome how much you have committed to that particular player when he's just not generating enough in itself. Now, the more recent trend has very much been leaning into these role players. The Denver Nuggets are absolutely the blueprint for that. That you have Nikola Jokic, you have Jamal Murray, two guys that are legitimate stars, even though Jamal Murray has not quite gotten his flowers with an all-star appearance to this point. And then you find the right complementary pieces around him. The Aaron Gordons of the world, the Michael Porter Jr.'s, the Kentavious Caldwell-Popes, the Christian Brauns, all guys that play within their system up to the level that is necessary and bring out the best in those players in the same way that the stars bring out in them. That can be done right if you get those guys right. But on the other side of things, if you do it the wrong way, if you're thinking, I can go 8 deep in a rotation, I can go 7 deep, 8 deep come playoff time, and then you get to the playoffs and only 5 or 6 of those guys are really ready to handle some major minutes, you put yourself in a bad spot too. So I think there are pros and cons to each direction. But I do want to acknowledge that it seems very clear these Sixers are leaning towards the star approach. And I do think that, of course, Daryl Morey leans that way, and I see because of the opportunity they presented with this cap space, which is incredibly rare given the position they have with an MVP caliber player and up-and-coming star, I understand the logic there. So I did want to dive into the pros and cons of each of these, and I'm going to start right off with a guy that would be my number one option if he's on the table, that being LeBron James here. And LeBron James this season averaged 25.7 points per game, 7.3 rebounds, 8.3 assists, 1.3 steals, 3.5 turnovers, shot 54% from the field and 41% from beyond the arc. He also shoots 45.7% on corner threes. 68.5% of his threes are assisted, and just 28.6% of his shots are from beyond the arc. So still a guy that wants to get downhill when things are coming to it. And the reason that I think there's a hesitancy on pumping up the go get LeBron, it's because he's very much in control of whatever he wants to do. Now, we did see that the Sixers were linked to Bronny James. That certainly indicates some sort of connection or correlation there. And for what it's worth, to acknowledge LeBron's contract head on, that he has a player option for $51.4 million with the Lakers. I will note that you can see the deadline for that is after the NBA draft, so LeBron will have the opportunity to see where Bronny ends up, debate how much that location is appealing to him, and make a decision from there. But I do think all signs are pointing to him returning to Los Angeles, and I think particularly the way that Clutch Sports and the management of Rich Paul and everyone else on the James camp there has made quite the effort to separate Bronny from LeBron as it pertains to him as a prospect and them playing together. Those breaks have certainly been pumped the more it's gotten closer to that actually being a possibility. So as much as LeBron would absolutely be a number one choice, and I do think a team that next year with LeBron James, Tyrese Maxey, and Joel Embiid can absolutely win an NBA championship, I don't think the likelihood of it is that high. So then we will shift to the guy who's most commonly been attached to that, and the guy that I still think is probably the most likely outcome of this, assuming that he does desire money in the way that it has been projected for a lot of these, but that is, of course, Paul George here. And Paul George this season averaging 22.6 points per game, 5.2 rebounds, 3.5 assists, 1.5 steals, 2.1 turnovers per game, shot 47.1% from the field overall, and 41.3% from beyond the three-point arc on some really high volume there. I believe it was 7.9 three-point attempts this season. He also shoots 45.7% on corner threes, 73.3% of his threes are assisted, and 47.6% of all shots come from beyond the three-point arc. So very much a high-volume three-point shooter there. That is incredibly appealing to me. That I think the biggest pro with Paul George, number one, from an archetype of player, he fits exactly what you want with Paul George or with Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid. Number two, I think it's really appealing how he can be this guy that you're looking at of being a creator, going out and getting your own bucket. And at the same time, he is a guy that is comfortable just being a floor spacer standing in the corner and being able to punish teams at a really high level when that opportunity presents itself. And probably the biggest driving force for why Paul George is so appealing is the Sixers have a chance to just outright sign him, that he will be a guy on the free agent market. There still is not a deal in place between Paul George and the Clippers, and for what it's worth, the Sixers are going to have to throw the max here, and I have no issue with that because of the opportunity that they're presented, that you're not risking losing Joel Embiid, you're not risking losing Tyrese Maxey, and you still will have a little bit of leftover money to play with beyond just Paul George, even if you give him the full max, which will come in 4-year deal, $212.2 million. That is only $8.9 million shy of the most the Clippers can offer, and it does not seem like the Clippers are looking at getting up to that number either. That the Clippers very much short selling a little bit, saying we're not giving you this type of max contract, so that gap could absolutely swing in the Sixers' favor. There also is a point that I did want to discuss here, that for all the perception of Daryl Morey, which I think he's one of the more forward-facing, just front office personnel in the entire NBA, we know the way that he is more in the public eye than just about anybody. We've also seen the downside of that. There are certainly players who do not like Daryl Morey, James Harden being at the forefront of it. That we remember last year was James Harden bringing in the Daryl Morey is a liar sign to a club, yelling it for all that he can see at his Adidas camps. I do wonder, after a year playing with James Harden, where Paul George and James Harden certainly had to have some sort of conversation about what went wrong in Philadelphia, what their perception of Daryl Morey is. I don't think that helps the Sixers' case, and I do think that's something that has not gotten talked about much. In general, I think the relationship aspect of the NBA is overstated, that money talks far louder than words, and if the Sixers are handing a full-scale max, it might make Paul George be able to overlook some past just doubts that he's had that were likely put in his head from James Harden, but I do think that was an interesting thing to note there. Now, the next guy that I want to jump into, another guy that has gotten a ton of discussion and a familiar face in Philadelphia, Jimmy Butler, looking a little bit different than that picture there that he, of course, took on Media Day. But this season, Jimmy Butler averaged 20.8 points per game, 5.3 rebounds, 5.0 assists, 1.3 steals, just 1.7 turnovers, 49.9% from the field, 41.4% from beyond the three-point arc, which is a career high from him, just around 2 attempts per game, so not the high-volume guy, but it is nice to see the efficiency there. He also shoots 44.3% on corner threes, 80% of his threes are assisted, and as I mentioned, just 18.3% of his shots come from beyond the arc, so not a high-volume guy. Also about to turn 35, will be by the time things kick off next offseason. And where the Jimmy Butler conversation comes into here is the contract as well. That does seem to be a bit of the reason why he could possibly shake free from Miami, that he wants a max contract and they don't seem ready to give it to him. That there are some concerns with the availability of Butler. We know the way that he does kind of coast through the regular season, then turns up for the playoffs. Anything that I'll say about Jimmy, and to get the contract out of the way exactly here, we have him with 1 year remaining and then a player option for $52 million next year, and him, of course, desiring the max contract after it. I have no issue with paying him that amount of money these next 2 years. It is beyond that I start to get concerned. And with Jimmy, he's definitely probably the best creator out of this. I mean, kind of for others, setting the table for others, although LeBron probably still better, so maybe take that back a little bit. But what I like about Jimmy and what he can provide to the Sixers team, it does feel like they lack a little bit of point guard play sometime, that Tyrese Maxey has improved leaps and bounds in that specific area, but he's still a guy that is a score-first guy, and I think that's fine to lean on naturally. When you have a guy like Jimmy, that he can create for others, that Tyrese is perfectly comfortable and effective as a floor spacer that can knock down shots created for him. Frankly, I would like to see a little more off-ball Tyrese Maxey this year because of the way he's so dangerous as a shooter, and you can kind of parlay that with his ability to beat guys off the dribble, get downhill, and everything else there. So Jimmy Butler is a guy that could help accomplish that. but you're kind of getting it from both ends if Jimmy Butler is the route, because you have to pay him and because you have to give up assets to trade him, because obviously the Miami Heat are not just going to let him walk no matter how much that he bothers him. That we know the way they operate down there, and Jimmy, they will trade you if you continue to stir up a fit. The Sixers kind of need that to happen for him to come available. And the last piece that I did want to bring up here, it is Brandon Ingram. This is the guy that I think is the closest to this category of player. I do think once you chop off these four, there is a little bit of a gap. I'm going to dive into some Zach LaVine conversation, which I think is interesting, but I think he falls in a different category than these guys, so I did want to separate it for the video here. But to dive into what Brandon Ingram brings to the table, we're going to begin by pulling up his stats here. 20.8 points per game this season, 5.1 rebounds, 5.7 assists, just 0.6 blocks and 0.8 steals, but he did shoot 49.2% from the field, just 35.5% from three, and not on super high volume either. He shot 3.8 three-point attempts per game, which for reference is 0.1 higher than what Tobias Harris shot this year. And both Ingram and Harris have a little bit of the bad habit of pump faking out of three-pointers to take tough contested twos. But Ingram did shoot 35.5% on corner threes. Would like that number a little bit higher, but not super concerning there. 77.9% of his threes are assisted, and 23.8% of his shots come from beyond the three-point arc area. That is the story with Brandon Ingram. He is known to be more of this mid-range killer, that he's a little bit of DeMar DeRozan in his game. He is younger, which is a huge point in his favor and is nice to see there. And for what it's worth, there are seasons with Ingram has attempted over 6 3-point attempts per game. I do think there is some value to acknowledging it has not been an ideal just roster construction situation for him, with guys like Zion Williamson operating in similar spaces, and of course players like Trey Murphy and CJ McCollum becoming the long-range bombers and kind of jumping him in the pecking order from an offensive standpoint there. And for what it's worth, another appealing part to Ingram is it would give the Sixers a little more flexibility. You are going to have to pay this guy as well, so you have to keep that in mind. But when looking at the contract for this year, it does give him a little bit more flexibility than these other options. And to lay out the numbers specifically, heading into the final year of his deal, $36 million. So in comparison to these guys touching about 40, you're freeing yourself up with $14 million for this specific offseason that you could find ways to maybe add in some other pieces. Maybe that helps you bring in a Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, or helps you bring back Kelly Oubre, or whatever the case may be. There is a little bit more of that flexibility that comes with Brandon Ingram. He's another guy who can create for others, which is appealing to me. Again, I do think the Sixers need a little bit of that from whichever these guys they end up landing on, but it does feel like the options are narrowing. Now, my point of concern and my biggest downfall that I want to end this with is, feels like each of these options, the Sixers aren't fully in control of. That in every single one of these, I guess Ingram may be slightly different. I mean, the Sixers are going to go out and have to trade for 3 out of the 4 of these guys with Ingram, possibly not with LeBron, but certainly with Ingram and Jimmy. It is a situation where they need Jimmy to act a fool. They need Jimmy to do his thing to force out. For Paul George, he has to outright circle the Sixers and say, I want to go there. For LeBron James, he essentially has to outright circle the Sixers and say, I want to go there. And that's a difficult spot to be put in. It does not feel like they're fighting on equal ground here, that it does feel like the Sixers need something to break their way in order to accomplish one of these big fish coming in. And the biggest fear is if that does not happen, because the Sixers have spent so much time preserving this cap space, making decisions based on creating future flexibility. That was all for this specific offseason, and if you're not able to capitalize on all those aspects that you did work so hard to create, it's got to be viewed as a failure. So for the Sixers right now, you got to find a way to get it done. That Daryl Morey simply has to figure out the way to get one of these big fish to surround with Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey. There will not be another opportunity, at least during the Joel Embiid era, and likely in many situations across the NBA, where you will have a spot like right now, where you have an MVP caliber player, you have a rising superstar in Tyrese Maxey, and you have the available money to go get a true third star to add to that. You got to nail it. You got to get it right. And let's see what happens with that. So let me know in the comments what your guys' preference would be for that third star. Which of these 4 options appeals to you the most? Or if there's any other guys that you would rather. Do you tend to lean more towards the role player side of things? And just for what it's worth, I will like to point out that those guys get paid quite handsomely as well. Like, we're not talking about adding 5 new guys. We're talking about Bruce Brown being paid $25 million, or Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. I expect to be in a similar ballpark of that. That's a lot of money to contribute to guys that are far more limited as players than the ones that we just spoke about earlier on in this video. So I get the hesitancy there from Daryl Morey's standpoint as well. But regardless, I do want to hear from you guys in the comments. Also, make sure you are smashing that subscribe button to keep the Digest family growing there. We're going to have some big things coming this week. We got a live stream brewing. We're going to talk about all these options a little bit more in depth and a more expanded period with my guy Cliff Jackson over there. So stay tuned for that. Drop a like on this video. I'm going to talk with you next time right here on Sixers Digest. Peace.